Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sitting here today with Farid Dadashev, Global Co-Head Mining and Metals Investment Banking at RBC Capital Markets, to talk about copper. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Farid, as we all know, copper has been a hot topic in recent months, and a lot been going on in our market recently, from mine disruptions, production slashes, stockpiling in the US, low inventories, and last week we saw copper prices hitting all-time high. What is your take on that, and what is RBC copper outlook for 2026?
No, look, thanks for asking me this question. This is a very topical question, right? I think it's fair to say that everyone right now is looking for copper. Those who actually produce copper are looking for copper, and even those who don't produce copper, they actually want to get into copper, right? We've seen some of the gold companies going into copper these days as well, right? So naturally, it is going to become very, very competitive. We already seeing all of that, but I think you touched on quite a few very relevant points in terms of we have seen a lot of supply the disruptions. So it's not just about the demand being all-time high, but it's also the supply, and not just the new supply, but the supply that has been on the market already. We've seen quite a number of disruptions. We've seen because of the gold grades being lower than expected. We've seen some seismic activity. We've seen some, like ramp ups taking a little bit longer. So all of that had a very negative impact on the copper production this year, and I think it was down by 6 to 7%, which is which is higher than the usual, right? So if you combine supply being not there, demand being all time, obviously that's the reason why the copper price is extremely high, right? But in my view, it is still not at the level where it should actually guarantee that the miners start sanctioning large-scale multi-billion-dollar projects, because those projects, they take a very long time. They take, between, actually from exploration to the commercial production, it's around 18 years, like plus minus, right? But to actually build the projects, it's around 3 to 5 years, right? So what you don't really want to do, sanction the project, start spending the money, and then for some reason, the price at the end is not at the level which actually makes sense, right? So for that reason, the marginal price has to be at a certain level, and I do feel like where we are today, it's getting to the right place on the long-term price, but still not there yet.
That is very interesting, and bearing in mind that we are slightly moving away from energy transition into the energy addition, so-called, with a renewed interest in uranium and coal. Do you still think that copper will be more expensive in the next decade?
I think so. Look. I mean, it's obviously a very fair question about potential the substitutions, right? And I mean, a lot of discussions previously about aluminium, among others, right? Which is probably the case, but not in every application, right? So for that reason, I do feel like the consumption of copper will still stay there, right? So hence, like for example, like between now and 2035, right, the demand for copper is going to go by around 25%, right? So that's effectively additional 8 million tons of copper that we need to find somewhere. And just to put it in some perspective, that's around 7 to 8 Escondidas, which is the largest copper mine in the world. And frankly speaking, between now and 10 years from now, it's really hard to think where that additional copper is going to come from, right? So and that will be between 270 to 300 billion dollars of new investment, right? And in the last 5-6 years, we only spent around 75. So this is a very big numbers here, right? And the reason why companies will be putting all this capital in use is that there is an understanding that if we don't do it now, we will already have a structural deficit, right? But we might have even a lot more of that, right? So hence why it doesn't really matter which scenario you are considering. I think the world will need a lot more copper than we can think of today.
I mean, I think everyone is talking about it, to be honest with you. And you also mentioned that taking the mine from exploration to production takes years and years. Yeah. But having said that, we also know that the junior mining companies are facing the finance gap. How do we realistically can tackle that?
I think like this is a very good question, right, Harin? I think the challenge that we're facing today is there's a lot of this conceptual supply on paper, right? Which is, for example, a junior mining company which owns like a deposit requiring a multi-billion dollars of capex, right? Not in every situation, obviously. In some situations, they don't have the expertise, so they don't have the money. It's hard, right? So that supply is on paper, but in reality, that supply will less likely come into the market in the next 10 years unless they do a joint venture or another company acquires that mining junior and starts putting their own expertise and finance to basically build those projects, right? So unless that happens, it's very difficult to see how that project, that deposit can actually be developed, right? But that being said, we also have seen quite a few success stories when juniors, what they did do, they found a partner, either from Japan or somebody from the government, or we're also seeing some of the royalty and stream the transaction, because a lot of the corporate deposits, they're also coming with gold. And we've seen some of the streaming and royalty companies in the last 12 to 24 months being very actively, like investing into those early stage projects, right? That gives them the money to continue drilling, like make those deposits better, and hopefully the valuation is going to go up, right? So it takes a little bit of time, right? But obviously for juniors, it's hard, but it's not impossible, right? So, so there are avenues how they can potentially get the funding, advance their work, right? A development program, and either in the future, either sell it to somebody who has the experience and has the financing capacity, or do it themselves through the partnerships.
I think it's a really good point, as you said, that the juniors will be looking for more unconventional sources of funding and looking for partnerships either from royalty and streaming companies or from major corporations. But I also think we are seeing that recently governments take a more active role in securing critical minerals, especially copper, from increased permitting scrutiny to new national strategies and proposed stockpiles. How do you see the growing government involvement shaping copper supply in terms of the project timelines and investor sentiments over the next decade?
Yep. No, thank you for this, Arina. Look, this is very fascinating times for us here on the mining side, right? We're seeing a lot of attention from the investors. We're seeing a lot of attention from all the stakeholders. We're seeing a lot of attention from the governments, right? Governments have always been very sensitive about the mining because mining, and specifically copper, among others, have all been very strategic metals, right? But I think now in the last few years, since the security of supply became an absolutely strategic narrative, right? We've seen governments not just, not just supporting, but also actively taking role. And this has been manifested in various performance shapes. Like we've seen a couple of years ago, Manara, which is Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's, mining vehicle that took a position in Vale base metals, like we're seeing now, in the United States, government, like playing a very active role. And will this continue? Will such trend continue? Probably yes, right? So, and that's another reason why, Irina, I think there is more upside to copper price as opposed to like we have already achieved the ceiling, right? So if you basically start, computing all these factors that, like the world needs a lot more copper and there are various reasons and the rationale why is going to be important, I do feel like, like the copper price probably has more power to go because, as I said earlier, regardless which scenario you look at, like the world will need a lot more copper, right? So for that the reason, given, like the copper companies, they need more copper. And we've seen a lot of recent M&A, and the rationale for that was to basically unlock the copper. Like we've seen the gold, the companies, looking at obviously gold and also the copper, you know what I mean? And the governments, for various reasons, they're also looking to secure different critical minerals, and probably copper is going to be at the top of their agenda, right? So for that the reason, it sounds like 2025 has been a very busy year, but it sounds like 2026 and onwards, I will expect the level of activity to also remain pretty high for us.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for that. And I think the last question that I have for you is around M&A activity. So we do know that in a past year or so, we've seen a lot of M&A going on in the market. So Dundee Precious Metals acquired Adriatic Metals, BHP and London joint acquisition of Filocorp, and then of course a recent merger of Anglo American and Teck, where RBC were one of the advisors. Any thoughts on that you can share?
Look, obviously, as I mentioned, 2025 was a very busy year for us, has been a very busy year for us, and I will probably think that level of activity, level of the discussions, still pretty high in terms of across the sector, right? I do feel like, investors responded pretty positively across the board for any transaction which involve the synergy. Their synergetic rationale is very important. Like you mentioned about, Dundee and the Adriatic. It was a very interesting transaction where, both kind of companies, operate in the same postcode, and the share price on both sides has increased since the announcement. I think investors, they kind of welcome all of that, where 2 + 2 = kind of 5. And we do feel like, and I do feel like, the mining industry, like 20 years ago, there was a lot of focus on the volume, the scale as opposed to value. Now things have changed significantly. Obviously, we all kind of learned the lesson. The mining industry learned the lesson. They listened to the investors, and now the deals which are happening today, in most cases, they've been very well received because there was a very strong rationale why the boards are doing the transactions, right? So, the deals that you just mentioned, it made a lot of sense. Your share price responded pretty positively. And it's not just about let's be the number one, like Rio Tinto recently had the Capital Markets Day where Simon Trott mentioned that I want to be the most valued mining company in the world, right? Focus on that as opposed to the largest, right? So all of that gives us the confidence that, people that talk about, mining sector, you got 2-3 good years and then maybe the 2-3 not so good years. But I think all the actions the industry has taken over the past 10 or 15 years give me some confidence that maybe the good days will last a little bit longer, right? So that's why I said before, I'm really excited about 2026.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Farid, and thank you for taking time to come to us and to do this interview.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Irene.
Thank you very much for watching, and a huge thank you to Farid Dadashev, Global Co-Head of Mining and Metals Investment Banking at RBC Capital Markets, for his valuable insights. If you want to hear more conversations like this, make sure you join us at Mining Indaba on 9th to the 12th of February 2026 in Cape Town. Register today to secure your ticket, and we will look forward to seeing you there.